Welcome to a conversation on international affairs. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our distinguished guest today is Herbert F. York, Director of the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation of the University of California. Professor York has more than 30 years of distinguished public service. He was the first director of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, the first chief scientist at the Advanced Research Projects Agency in the Pentagon, the first director of research and engineering at the Pentagon, the first chancellor of UC San Diego, and then U.S. ambassador to the Comprehensive Test Ban negotiations. Professor York is most recently the author of Making Weapons, Talking Peace, a physicist's odyssey from Hiroshima to Geneva. Professor York, welcome to Berkeley.
Thanks, Harry.
You got your PhD here, right?
Yes, I did.
What was it like to be part of that community of nuclear scientists during World War II and after?
Well, in a word, it was great. It was really a very stimulating place. Lawrence was alive, and he had gathered around him a number of very exciting persons, all of whom were variously smart, ambitious, good scientists, hard workers. And it was an extremely exciting place, made more so, not just by the people and so on that I described, but also by the fact that a lot of ideas had been stimulated by the war or even independently, but during the war, and were waiting to be tried out, so that there was a lot of pent-up energy and ideas just waiting to be tried, that those first half dozen years after the war provided an opportunity for all of that.
Tell us a little about Lawrence. Remind us of what he had achieved in that field and why he was such a magnet.
Well, he was a physicist inventor, and during the early 30s he made a very important invention called the cyclotron, a means for accelerating particles to very high energies through the use of combined electrical and magnetic fields. And that particular kind of technology, that is the technology of accelerating particles through that kind of combination of things, has persisted to this day, and the big accelerators we see around the world today are all, in a sense, derived from the very first ideas he promoted here in Berkeley in the 30s. I didn't come here until he was already 10 years into that work, so I wasn't in at the very beginning. But he won a Nobel Prize for that, and rightly so. He became a very important figure on the Berkeley campus and was and in the world of science as a whole. Then, when the war came along, he was one of the people who pushed hardest, perhaps the person who pushed hardest, on the notion of getting the Manhattan Project going and developing the first, building and developing the first nuclear weapons. That is, the idea that that was possible suddenly burst on the world in 1939, but the question of exactly how you could do that, if you could do it in a short time, and especially during the war, remained undecided for quite some time. And Lawrence was an optimist, a technical optimist, an optimist in other ways too. And so it was he who first became convinced, one of the earliest to become convinced that it was all possible and that it was all important.
And the Manhattan Project was not just based in Los Alamos. In other words, parts of the project were scattered all over the country.
It was all over the United States, and it's named for the fact that one of the early headquarters offices was in Manhattan. Mm-hmm. But the Los Alamos was the place where the bomb was actually designed, and finally the parts and so on for it were made. But the key to the program was not merely how to put one together, but how to produce the very unusual special materials necessary for doing so. Either plutonium, which had not existed on the Earth before World War II, or U-235, which did exist, but which was mixed with other forms of uranium in a way that couldn't be used. The problem was to create those materials in useful forms. That work was done at Berkeley, at Columbia, at Chicago, at the universities in those places mainly, other universities too, Iowa State, and then by a number of industrial organizations in Oak Ridge, in Washington, and so on.
As a minor participant in these projects, I mean, did you have a sense of what the whole was about?
Yes, but not a fully accurate sense. I mean, I didn't know all the details. From the very beginning, and even before I arrived, you know, the notion was in the air, so that I was pretty well convinced before I got to Berkeley that that's what the laboratory was doing, although nobody specifically told me. After I got here, they did, and confirmed what I already knew. But there still were a lot of details that I didn't know until the war was over and the Smythe report was published, and I got to read it all.
Do you, well, I bet that you are asked a lot about whether you have any second thoughts of having participated in some aspect of building the
Yes, it's a natural question.
Yeah. And what is your response? You talk a little about that in the book.
Well, given what given what could possibly have known at the time, it was the only reasonable thing to do. Not only what I did, but I mean what the country did. And you know, as at least partial supporting evidence for that notion is the fact that virtually everybody who was invited to participate was eager to do so, and that second thoughts are all after the fact. But that doesn't, you know, that's only the beginning of the question. The fact is that it was history's greatest, you know, military disaster. There were perhaps 50 million people killed in World War II. And contributing to getting the war over at the earliest possible date seemed like a very important and noble cause. Now, when it all happened, that is when Hiroshima was destroyed, and then Nagasaki, and then the Emperor surrendered, we were glad it happened, because it did end that terrible war. But at the same time, a lot of people were aware that the fact that we'd opened up a Pandora's box, I mean, I think it's a good analogy in this case. And the question was not so much what had happened, but what was going to happen. And the young group that I was associated with was not really privy to the discussions going on at high national and political levels, but I soon came to learn about them later. And I came back to Berkeley from Oak Ridge, which is where I was most of the war, to join the physics department here. Robert Oppenheimer was teaching here occasionally. Ernest Lawrence was developing the laboratory, changing the direction of the laboratory to its current post-war purposes. And so I came slowly to have some feeling for these issues. But I know much more about them because I've read about them in retrospect than because I remember them from the time.
The Lawrence laboratory here, there wasn't much in the way of political discussion, or was there during this
There
period?
wasn't as much as there was at some other places, because Lawrence himself discouraged it, especially among the young physicists like myself, the graduate students. He quite honestly felt that the thing a young graduate student ought to be doing is sticking his nose to the grindstone, and Lawrence would use, you know, homilies like that. In order to become a good scientist, and that was a noble and positive profession, and as well as an exciting one, and that the best way to behave at that age and place in a person's career was to focus on that. And it's possible that he pushed that idea also in part because he knew he wouldn't like the results of any political discussions. But beyond that, or more important than that, that I think is what that's the real Lawrence. I mean, that's what he believed.
This setting was one in which, besides being a talented physicist, you also had to be a jack of all trades, I gather.
Yeah. The laboratory was focused on the experimental approach, and that included making devices and you know, painting objects and sweeping the floor and a lot of other things like that, during the war especially.
How important was this work in nuclear physics for pushing Berkeley to the top academically, do you think? Is there any connection? I mean, did the...
Yes, I don't know how to weigh it against other things, but during the period, middle 30s to middle 40s, it was perhaps the outstanding feature of the academic landscape at Berkeley was Lawrence and the laboratory.
And after the war, the question arises, should there be a second weapons lab? I would like for you to discuss that debate, because
yes.
that's the next turning point in your life, really.
That arose quite a bit later. because it didn't arise out of World War II, it arose out of the Korean War. And the issue, there really are two quite separate tracks leading to the establishment of a second laboratory. One of those is essentially Edward Teller, who was a physicist at Los Alamos during the war and worked there partly as a consultant, partly full-time afterwards, and who felt that the hydrogen bomb was was something that needed to be pressed urgently. Even during the war, he pressed for it, and then after the war, he continued to. And finally, beginning in 1950, as a result of the Soviet atomic bomb, Truman authorized pressing ahead. And but Teller was always wanted more, and felt that even with presidential decisions and with the laboratory director assuring him that's what we're going to do, that there wasn't really enough happening. So he was always dissatisfied from the early wartime period when it was Oppenheimer he felt that was frustrating him, to the later period when he thought it was politics and when he thought Director Norris Bradbury wasn't doing enough. So he was always dissatisfied, and so somewhere in there in 1950 or wherever, he developed the view that the only solution to this was a second laboratory where they would do things right.
And he wanted something. We should explain that. I mean, he wanted to build a weapon that, yeah.
Well, his focus was the hydrogen bomb, which everyone conceived of in those days as being 1,000 times as big as the atomic bomb, and therefore as big a step up as the last step had been, the step to the atomic bomb. So one root for all of this is Teller's dissatisfaction with the American program, the way it was being run, and the conclusion that the only way to fix what was wrong was to start over with a new laboratory. The other route involves Ernest Lawrence and some of the young people who were associated with him, including myself, and really the Korean War. The Soviet atomic bomb in the fall of 1949, just as it had re-stimulated Teller's views, broadly affected people and brought a lot of people to thinking about, what does it mean and what should we do, what should our response be. And since it was a technical event, it was natural to think of technical answers. And so Lawrence also began looking for ways to re-involve himself and the laboratory in the national defense. And he explored a number of possibilities, like building reactors for making tritium and building a big, huge accelerator for making plutonium or tritium, a number of channels. And, but he was, at the same time as he was exploring these things himself, he was aware of what Teller was thinking. And so he also chose to explore that same question: would a second laboratory be a good idea? But by the time he got to this question, several of us here, most importantly Hugh Bradner and myself, had gone down to Los Alamos on a visiting basis to help them out with some of the experiments for their first tests relating to thermonuclear processes, tests which were conducted in the Pacific in 1951. So I knew something about what was going on at Los Alamos and about the program generally. So for that reason, or for whatever other reasons, I just finished my PhD in 49. Lawrence asked me what I thought about it. Should there be a second laboratory? He said that some of his friends in the Atomic Energy Commission had asked him. So I began exploring that particular question in earnest. And that involved going to Los Alamos, talking with Teller and the people there, going to Washington, talking with the people there in the Defense Department and the Atomic Energy Commission, and others, and other interested parties, other knowledgeable parties. And my conclusion finally was that there was room for a second laboratory. And whether there was a need for one, I wasn't quite so sure, but there was a place for one. And it could make a positive contribution in the sense of expanding our programs in high-tech national security, in particular in this thermonuclear hydrogen bomb area. And so that was in the spring of 1952. And Lawrence became convinced that that was the right thing to do. I think maybe he was convinced before I reached my conclusions, but I certainly reinforced them. And so he then proposed to start a second laboratory, and that's what changed everything. When only Teller was pushing for a second laboratory, it was easy for Washington to reach the conclusion that it was not a good idea, that it would divert talent and resources from Los Alamos, that the people weren't there, that it would just be too big a job. When Lawrence said, I'll do it, and I'll find the people, namely, people I've already got, me and others at the laboratory at Berkeley, that changed everything. And so the opposition to the establishment of a second laboratory tended to evaporate. And that summer, 1952, we opened up the Livermore Laboratory. But the key stimuli then, as far as the outside world is concerned, were the Soviet atomic bomb in '49, and then the creation of the Sino-Soviet bloc, and then the invasion of South Korea in 1950. All of those three major events all happened within 10 months, and they stimulated all sorts of things. I mean, they brought about the election of Eisenhower and the new look and the idea of massive retaliation. They brought about the establishment of other laboratories devoted to air defense. They brought about eventually the establishment of the large programs whose purpose was to build the long-range intercontinental rockets, and they brought about the establishment of the Livermore Laboratory.
How old were you at this point when Lawrence sent you to Livermore?
I was 30.
30. And Lawrence's leverage here, was it his reputation or the fact that he had his own lab which he controlled? I mean, where did he have this lead?
Those go together.
Yeah.
He had a reputation among the nuclear establishment in Washington and elsewhere as being a person who could, organize or accomplish most anything. And so it was his reputation for getting things done quickly and under difficult circumstances that, and the fact he already had this laboratory was the concrete evidence of that.
What was your biggest challenge in going out there and setting this operation?
Getting things going, getting the people.
And you were able to draw primarily on the group around Lawrence, his students?
Nearly, yes. As far as physicists and scientists are concerned, to the level of 95%, they all came from Berkeley. And some of them had interesting careers subsequently. One of them was Harold Brown, who had recently come as a postdoc. Another was John Foster, who had been there as a student and a postdoc. The present director, who I expect will be retiring shortly, Roger Batesel, was also one of them. One of the interesting things about the Livermore Laboratory is that from 1952 until now, 1988, all of the directors have been people who were there at the very beginning.
So that has that been useful for maintaining the identity and integrity of the place?
Yes, I think so. On the other hand, it probably has its negative side, that brings a certain amount of intellectual baggage, and so I'm glad that there's about to be a real break and a real change in that.
How would you characterize your leadership style there? I mean, with all this talent around it, did it make it easier for you, or? Well,
yes, and the fact we were all young and naive also made it easier. I simply followed what I understood to be Lawrence's way of doing things, which was to be really quite freewheeling and with minimal organization. And it worked fairly well. And also to keep the place interesting, to keep the work interesting, as a substitute for the kind of interest that goes with basic research, we practiced the philosophy of always pushing against the technological margins, trying to make the biggest, the smallest, the lightest, always probing the technological extremes.
Now, is that an operating philosophy that that works when an institution gets mature, like Livermore?
Well, it works to a degree. On the other hand, there certainly are changes that go with maturity, and the laboratory is, as your question implies, now 36 years old.
Mm-hmm. How important in setting this up was the relationship to the university? Obviously, Lawrence was a link here, but would this have been possible had it not been a part of the University of
Well,
California?
it would not have been possible with the same speed, and it would not have been possible for me to have done it. I mean, it was the fact that Lawrence and the laboratory were behind me that made it possible for me to do it. It was the fact that Lawrence and the laboratory was behind it that made it easy for this group of young scientists, including the ones I named, to go out there. We all knew that you know, if things didn't work out, there was that much larger institution of which we were a part standing behind us that we could go back to or whatever. I don't know what was in the minds of everybody, but that kind of thinking. And the fact that the University of California was a great institution that that one could take pride in being a part of meant that it was easier to recruit other people to come. So it was easier for those of us who started the laboratory to make the transition out to Livermore, which was out in the boonies at that time. And we saw it, I saw it, as being a way, as being a great recruiting aid for getting other people, so that it was essential. I mean, in my view, we could not have done what we did. I couldn't have done what I did without in some other way. I mean, doing it by essentially moving a bunch of young people from Berkeley out to Livermore was the way we did it, and the only way I could have done it.
Now, this suggests a prerequisite for establishment of the institute, but we're
Yes.
constantly presented with the issue of whether the relationship should be continued. Is that something you would like to offer some thoughts on? In other words, is the relationship still as important as it was?
Well, it is still important. It's probably nowhere near as important as it was, but it couldn't have been done any other way, and there is, in my view, not adequate reason for changing it. The historical fact is that the Los Alamos Laboratory came out of World War II, and the Livermore Laboratory came out of the Korean War, both periods in which there was a wide degree of unanimity among the American people with respect to the notion there was an external threat that had to be faced. So it came from that kind of broadly based notion that something was needed, and each of these laboratories was part of the response in each of those two cases. At the present time, a lot of water over the dam, a lot of changes. The laboratory could perfectly well be operated in some other way. Of course, I mean, I couldn't help but be aware of the fact that this has been an issue over a long time and within the university. And I've recommended the laboratory that they themselves consider it. I mean, is this really what you think today is the right way to do things? My own conclusion is that on balance, things are better continued as they are.
How has the university benefited from the relationship, do you think?
Well, I think the university's not been the main beneficiary. I mean, I could answer that question. I think the university has benefited in certain ways, and it's probably been damaged in certain ways as well. And I think the net is favorable, but it's very much an argument. The beneficiary has been the country. That is to say, the United States gets a better program in this area from this arrangement than it would from any other arrangement that I know about. And I have experience with a number of alternative ways of doing things. There are freestanding nonprofit corporations like RAND or Aerospace. There are wholly owned subsidiaries of large corporations like Sandia. So there are other ways of doing it. But I think that this one provides the government with the best program. And when I say provides the government with the best program, it's clear that despite the fact there's a lot of dispute and argument and opposition, nevertheless, the overwhelming consensus of the American people as represented by what the Congress does, as well as what the President proposes, has been that it wants to continue with a nuclear component to our national preparedness.
In your book, you talk about the implications of your philosophy of pushing technology to the limits, and you say this approach meant that the laboratory leadership had to engage in a continual effort to sell its ideas to anticipate military requirements and to suggest to the U.S. military ways in which its new designs could be used to enhance preparedness and better support our general nuclear strategy. Is that a result that was appropriate for that time? And does that approach still continue?
Well, it probably still continues, and it's still valid to a degree, but not to the same degree. That's an area where there really has been a large change. In the 40s and 50s, which is what we're talking about, nuclear weapons were still new. And the question of what they could do and what varieties they could come in and how they might be delivered and how they might be used, everything was uncertain and fluid. Tactics, strategy, hardware, delivery systems, military organization, everything was fluid. And therefore, there was room for all sorts of new ideas, and there was a certain necessity to explore all the possibilities and eliminate some and adopt others and so forth, according to the national interests and whatever. Nowadays, it's a mature technology, and so the relative position of the laboratories, and you might say the rest of the world, has changed. Whereas in the 40s and 50s, they took the lead, and strategy, tactics, delivery systems, and so on followed. That hasn't been true for 25 years. The last quarter century, what happens is the strategists think of something, the tacticians think of something, the rocket people invent a new delivery system or something, and then they ask the laboratory to provide an optimum package to go on board or to satisfy that purpose, so that the total situation has changed, and the role of the laboratories, the question of whether the laboratories are or not in a leading role, is completely changed. And as I see it, the laboratories were in a leading role with determining what was happening up until about 1960, and since 1960, 65, the initiative has been elsewhere.
When your service as director of Livermore, and you then went into government service, serving various committees of the Eisenhower administration, and then finally becoming director of research and engineering, and so on. What new insights did you get from sort of this change of perspective on some of the same sorts of problems?
Yeah, well, it was a large change in perspective, and it seemed so at the time, and in retrospect it still seems so. I got a bigger view, a broader view of what national security was all about, and in a period of 6 months or so, I came to accept quite fully Eisenhower's view of all of this, which was that we needed a substantial program of national security. We needed to maintain a high level of military preparedness, but that there were limits, and in fact it was bad to go beyond these limits, and that nuclear weapons in particular represented such a danger for the long run that something had to be done to contain the growth of the nuclear component, and that some kind of and that in addition to unilateral actions, building forces, developing new systems, and so on, it was necessary to negotiate, to use diplomacy, to explore the possibilities of arms control. And so I adopted the point of view that's characterized by his farewell address, in which it's usually quoted wrong. He said that, essentially he said, we need a military-industrial complex, but precisely because we need it, we have to make sure that it just doesn't go too far or develop a momentum of its own that produces results that we don't want. And the same way with the scientific technological elite. I mean, he meant the people working in the security area. We need them, he said, but we need to make sure that they somehow don't capture public policy as a result of the fact we need them. So I became a strong supporter of his approach to the whole question, including the need for negotiated arms control, disarmament. And when I was in the Pentagon, I was one of his primary supporters within the government for going ahead with with the test ban negotiations of the late 50s and with other similar measures.
And where was the primary opposition to, for example, some sort of a test ban coming from? I mean, was it from your laboratory, the lab that you had left? It was all over
it came from there, but it was much broader than that. It came from within the Washington nuclear establishment, probably even more importantly than the laboratories, but you know, maybe I'm not balancing that right. And from within the military, who felt that restrictions of this kind were, you know, were unnecessary and of no particular value. In other words, there were people who felt that there are a lot of negative things. One is you can't trust the Russians anyhow. The other is that these inhibitions have no broad, really don't improve. Putting inhibitions on ourselves, even if they're bilateral, doesn't really accomplish a useful result. And we need these systems for the kind of security to solve the kind of security problems we foresee. So there was opposition from within the military, opposition from within the nuclear establishment, and included within the nuclear establishment was the laboratories. Yes.
And I mean, the debates on these issues could be rather intense. There's an account in your book where at one meeting with some other officials from the AEC and elsewhere that over the question of how reliable were our means of verifying what the Soviets were doing, that you were even called a traitor.
Well, it was even a simpler fact than that. You know, the question was, this is the period during the nuclear test moratorium, and that is, was there or was there not evidence that the Soviets are cheating? Mm-hmm. And I think I knew everything there was to know, and my conclusion was, no, they're not, and it was the conclusion of someone else, yes, they are, and that my saying there weren't was equivalent to treason.
Mm-hmm. What do you account for Eisenhower's insight, perception on these issues? I mean, was the fact that he had been the great general that he had in the war?
Surely that played an important role. That he knew war and the enormous pain and suffering it could cause, and that conventional war without nuclear weapons was already beyond what could reasonably be borne, and that nuclear weapons only made it worse, and somehow or other that problem that had to be faced directly. And that simply relying on nuclear deterrence for maintaining peace, while that was necessary at the moment and for at least the foreseeable future, it was not the way to plan the indefinite future.
In looking at the Eisenhower administration, you make the argument that administration put into place a paradigm that really defined our nuclear arsenal and what it could do. That you call it a revolution, and that all that followed was evolutionary. What was the tenets there of that revolution?
Well, I could expand on that almost indefinitely.
Okay.
But from the point of view of theoretical ideas, Eisenhower believed that we needed to maintain a high level of military preparedness, including nuclear forces, in order to preserve stability and peace, but that was not the way to go about it in the long run, and that one needed to promote negotiations, alliances, and other one needed to follow other approaches of that sort. So, and then he also, so there were those two things. I mean, there was the need for a high level, given the chaos and disorder in the world and lack of a system of law or law enforcement, was necessary to maintain substantial level of military preparedness, but it was also necessary to negotiate and find something better. And then, at a somewhat different level of detail, it was the conclusion that defense is impossible, and the first approaches to this question of strategic defense, which were made early in the Eisenhower administration, were abandoned by the end of the administration. Then in another more detailed sense, if you just look at all of the numbers that characterize the present systems, all of those numbers derive from the Eisenhower administration. At the end of the Eisenhower administration, the basic planning called for about 1,080 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and when we finally had a lot of rethinking and study and so on during the Kennedy administration, we came out with 1,054, the same number. And the notion of the triad came out of the Eisenhower administration. The notion of extended deterrence, that is not just deterrence of nuclear war, but deterrence of other major actions of aggression, comes out of the Eisenhower administration. That's been much refined with more complications added to it, but the basic notion's there. And the number, well, as I say, the triad, but even the details of the triad, 1,000. The Eisenhower administration had concluded that 45 nuclear missile submarines was the right number, and a restudy of that in the Kennedy administration came out with 41. So that essentially a major restudy of the detailed numbers in the Kennedy administration came up with numbers which were always within a few percent of the numbers that had already been decided by a more intuitive process during the Eisenhower administration.
Now, what was driving the system? I mean, technology and bureaucratic politics, in a way, sets a number?
Well, and money.
And
the
money.
I would say the most important factor is money, the availability of funds, because all of these decisions, whether to do something or to not do something, are made essentially in a funding context. The question of the size of the current American strategic nuclear force, the number of delivery vehicles, which is about 2,000, was decided in the period 1954-1955. It's never changed. It hasn't changed in more than 30 years. And at that time, it was essentially a debate, I think the best word, between the World War bomber generals on the one hand, who thought about how many airplanes we needed in terms of an attack on Europe with conventional bombs, the kind of synergism that the attacking forces get through having large numbers overcoming the defenses. In other words, thinking of that kind, the bomber generals deciding how many airplanes they needed on that basis. And as usual, the comptrollers and the budget directors telling them that they want more, there isn't that much money, you can't have that. And a sort of an iterative year-by-year budgetary process turned out to eventually came out with 2,200 as the number of strategic nuclear delivery vehicles that we decided to have in 1955 on alert, and we've never varied by more than 10% from that to today.
Now, interestingly enough, politically, what was going on at this time in the late 50s, during this period of transition to the next administration, was a public outcry in reports like the Gaither report that we really weren't doing enough, that there was a missile gap, and so on. Then, as you were saying, the Kennedy administration comes in and really changes very little. The numbers stay the same. Does that tell us anything about the way this sort of nuclear defense system has fit in to the political system?
Well, not just the nuclear system, but it tells you something about the inertia in any budgetary process of this size and complexity. Mm-hmm. You don't really start, people talk about starting with a blank piece of paper, but you simply can't do that with a large and complex system. You always start with last year's budget and modify it. Mm-hmm. And as far as the defense budget is concerned, and as far as the components of the defense budget are concerned, the major inputs are, one is the question of what are the new possibilities. Second is, what's the international scene? I mean, are things getting better or are they getting worse from the point of view of the general world relationship? And the third is, what can we afford? And those three are put together year by year, and it shouldn't be a surprise that it produces essentially the same result, because the basics never change that fast. I mean, the basics don't change on an annual basis, and so the final result doesn't change either. I mean, it just evolves extremely slowly. Once in a great while, something happens that forces everybody to really rethink things. And the Korean War was such an external event. The development of the hydrogen bomb and the development of intercontinental rockets were technological events. And those things did work revolutions. In other words, the military budget before the Korean War, the military budget after the Korean War, I mean, there was a big peak for the war, was 3 times bigger after the war than it was before. That's a revolution. Likewise, the introduction of intercontinental weapons carrying thermonuclear warheads, that was also a revolution. But those things don't happen very often, and there hasn't been one now in more than a quarter of a century.
So what about, or what is the end result of the ideological populist sentiments that are aroused during the electoral periods? During the Kennedy period, one thinks of the Cuban, the missile gap, which he raised against the Eisenhower administration. You know, many years later, the Reagan campaign was talking about a window of vulnerability. Do these things matter much in terms of changing the course of our defense policy?
They can matter, and they do matter to a degree. But when they finally work themselves out, when the elections are over and the bureaucracy has to actually figure out what really to do, they come up with an answer that's not very different because the circumstances really haven't changed all that much. But there are, I don't want to belittle the notion that changes do happen. The change from Eisenhower to Kennedy was nowhere near as much as people expected, or even, I think, as many analysts think actually happened. In other words, it's almost a commonplace among academics to say that there was a big change, and I dispute that. The change, though, from Carter to Reagan really was a bigger change. The way defense budgets changed, I mean, on an annual basis and then cumulatively over 5 to 7 years, was major. Although the defense budget is still not near as big as it was during the Eisenhower-Kennedy years as a percentage of GNP, it's nevertheless substantially up from what it had. I mean, there was really a change in the spending trends that took place when Reagan came in. And in the early Reagan years, the approach to negotiations was entirely different also. There's been now a second revolution within the Reagan administration in which the approach to negotiations is not all that different from his predecessors. But it took a number of years for that second change to take place.
This experience in government led you to a conclusion about the dilemma that we face in this area. You were involved in the transition. You worked with Mr. McCloy in sort of discussing the issues that the country faced, and then later in testimony before the Congress, you talked about this dilemma. Tell us about what you had in mind there.
There are a variety of ways there are a number of dilemmas and a variety of ways of putting them. But one of them has to do with defense itself. That is to say, I did, after several years in the Pentagon and looking at the entire program, come to a conclusion which was new to me at that time, and that is that although other people had said it before, and that is that defense against a nuclear attack really is impossible, strategic nuclear attack. Not only, and I concluded, not only was it possible in terms of what we knew at that time, but my judgment was it was going to remain impossible. And that meant, in somewhat expanded form, that there is no technical solution to the national security dilemma we face. And by the national security dilemma, I mean that the harder we try, the more dangerous the situation gets. Although it's kind of reached a saturation point in the last decades, it isn't, I don't see the situations changing very much today. But back at that time, it was still getting worse. The harder we tried to fix it, the worse it became, and the greater the threat to our own survival, our own particular survival as a nation, and the greater threat to mankind as a whole. So the conclusion was there is no technical solution to that problem. It can only be solved by political means. Lately, I mean, as years have gone by, I've expanded that conclusion somewhat to the notion that that even political means can't solve it very quickly, and that what's required is a substantial evolution in the international system, the kind of evolution that necessarily takes time.
Now, in the last part of your career, you move on to San Diego, you serve as chancellor there, and then now in your new role, you are director of the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. Tell us what that institution is trying to do.
Well, I look at the mission of the Institute along the lines that it was really presented to me, you might say, by David Saxon, who was president of the university when we started, and Governor Jerry Brown, who was governor of the state, as being primarily to get the University of California more broadly and deeply involved in an academic way with these large-scale issues of peace and security. Of course, there's always been many people within the university who were interested in these issues, and some of them included them within their academic activities. Others carried on in a private way, through political activism or otherwise. But what we're talking about is somehow helping to expand, not necessarily create from scratch, but helping to expand those activities within the university in which professors and students include peace and security issues among their normal in-university activities. And that means graduate students doing dissertations that in any of a number of fields, economics, political science, sociology, even physics, in which the dissertation satisfies the normal requirements for a degree, but the backbone in some way, the topic nevertheless relates in some way to the large-scale peace and security questions. And we have a summer teaching seminar designed to improve the knowledge of the faculty members who teach in this area. We even interact with our education abroad program, both in Asia and in Europe, to enrich the educational opportunities our students already have with some particular courses and seminars that relate again to these peace and security issues. So I don't take our mission to be to solve the peace and security problem. I take it to be to get the university more broadly engaged with this problem as part of its regular business, not as an add-on business. We're always looking for ways, we're not looking for ways to bring in somebody to start working in this area. We're looking for ways to make it easily possible or to stimulate people who are already here to devote their time and energies to these questions within the disciplines they're already within the departments and arrangements they already have.
Is this a step toward contributing to really public education in this area? Because if you look at this period that we're talking about, obviously public opinion has become increasingly important. It's had its peaks and its valleys, but increasingly it is very relevant to the debate that things cannot now be decided in the way they could in the past, really.
Well, there have been ups and downs, as you say, and furthermore, there hasn't so much, and there have been some shifts in the center of gravity, but I tend to see it more as there are periods when there's high polarization and periods of low polarization. Rather than any really fundamental shifts. And the early Reagan administration was a period in which there was enormous public interest on both sides of this issue. I mean, Reagan was elected by people who felt the prior administration was not paying enough attention to the threat posed by the Russians. When Reagan then began to talk in a way that was responsive to that part of the electorate, another part of the electorate said, "My God, what's he? Where is he taking us?" And they became active. So that, in my own judgment, a lot of people who saw peace activism as representing a net movement in America were simply focusing on one end of a polarized society, and forgetting that there was another large part of the American public that really felt quite oppositely. And in the later years of the Reagan administration, because he has turned back to the mainstream approach or closer to it, to arms control and so on, this polarization has melted to a certain degree.
In this last phase of, or the most recent, I should say, phase of your career, you've been involved a lot in East-West exchanges, the Pugwash meetings and so on. How important are these?
Well, they are of substantial importance, I think. The way they work is different at different times. When Pugwash, for example, was started, which was 1958, that was only 3 or 4 years after Stalin died. Communications were almost non-existent. There was no tourism. There were no international scientific meetings. international scientific meetings were just starting at the same time. 1956 was the first Rochester Conference, I think, and 55 was the first International Atomic Energy Conference. Pugwash came along 57. And so exchanges were very much inhibited, intellectual exchanges of all kinds. Those that dealt with political issues were more inhibited than others. And so the Pugwash movement was able to take a group of scientists and get them talking about combined scientific and political issues, the arms race in particular. And precisely because other channels were so rare and so clogged, it stood out. It provided a means for communication that was effective. And there are a number of cases of major ideas which were transmitted through that particular channel, all of them quite long ago. I mean, all the easiest cases all quite far back. But even today, that kind of exchange, which is now, there are many more such instances, and some of them aren't even particularly organized. I mean, you have a lot of people going back and forth. We're expecting a Russian visitor at our institute shortly. We've had one just a few weeks ago. The communication channels are just much broader and richer than they were. But these informal channels remain important. They can in no way substitute, in my view. There's no way that the informal and unofficial channels can substitute for the government channels, government-to-government channels, but they can speed the flow of ideas, and they can stimulate thinking at all levels, including the highest levels.
When one looks at the totality of your career, as one can in your book, there's a very great richness there. And one of the things that is striking is that, on the one hand, you've been a participant at various important decision points in the system, whether at the lab or in Washington or back at the university. And at the same time, you've also been a historian of all of these matters. So you've been both the well-situated participant and the observer, the trained observer. Any special insights that you want to leave us with from all of this rich history?
I'm not really a trained observer. Okay. I've had a lot of help from some very nice and friendly people within the university, or else because my academic training really is very different from social science.
But you've had the time and the support to look at these things.
Yes, yes, both in terms of individuals and in terms of the institution. And, you know, I just feel very fortunate and glad about it. I'm glad it worked out that way. It's certainly been interesting for me to have the opportunity to go from inside to outside and on more than one occasion. But
any insight that you can pass on about, you know, the complexity of the process that we haven't sort of talked about yet, that the way the people who are protesting, say, on the outside don't see the constraints on the people on the inside.
There certainly are large differences in the way they approach questions, in what the fundamental beliefs are, and so forth. And those differences can never be totally bridged. It simply is different to have a responsibility for something and have the monkey really placed on your back to decide what's got to be done right now, with almost always with insufficient information. That just creates a set of, you know, mental attitudes and a way of thinking and approaching problems that's different from what you can have when you can sit back and say, well, I don't know enough, I'll get some more information, and then take a year to do it. The two are different, and you can't really bridge them, but I know a lot of people in both of those circumstances. And I try myself to appreciate the point of view that goes not only with the beliefs but also with the situations, and to do a certain amount to try and bridge that gap.
Professor York, thank you very much for taking this time to talk with us about these issues. I'm sure that everybody will want to go out and read your book, Making Weapons, Talking Peace, A Physicist's Odyssey from Hiroshima to Geneva. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us for this conversation on international affairs.